Thank you for joining. My name is Jennifer. I'm with the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. When Linda, one of the event organizers and fellow high school alumni, asked me to participate today, we talked a lot about how in the workplace and in the work environment, there's a strong opportunity for us to advocate for mental health wellness and even identify people who might be at risk for suicide. So I thought, what a great topic for us to bring to a forum like this. I'm going to be talking today about how to identify people in your workplace or maybe in your community who might be at risk for suicide, and specifically how you might be able to go out and give them help, get them to help. I'm also going to be sharing at the end of this some of my personal story in both dealing with a suicide loss and having struggles with suicidal thinking as well in the past that I have since recovered from. So, let's talk about suicide as a health issue. One of the things that we really need to decouple is thinking about suicide in a class of its own and not a health condition. It is an unfortunate outcome in many cases of a very serious health condition. And the good news is that because it's a health condition, there is the chance to prevent suicide loss. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. In the workplace specifically, we want to advise that mental health should be treated in the exact same way as any other health condition. So if you're dealing with an employee or a coworker or even a manager who's struggling with mental health condition, please don't stigmatize them and think that it's different than if they're struggling with diabetes or cancer or something like that. The brain is an organ in the body, and because it's an organ in the body, it is subject and vulnerable to other physical health issues just like any other organ in our body. So please keep that in mind in the workplace. I'm going to be covering some statistics at a high level to make sure we all understand what a big issue suicide is and the cost of that issue to employment and employers and economic productivity in our country. I'm going to be talking about the research. One of the things people really want to understand is why. Why do people do this? Why do people take their lives? So I'm going to talk about what we've learned from some of the latest scientific research. We're going to talk about different prevention strategies, and then specifically, what can you do to help? So let's cover some basic statistics. In the world, this is a global issue. Somebody dies by suicide every 40 seconds. So imagine how many people we're going to lose just in the time that I'm up here talking. Nationally, it is the 10th leading cause of death. We lose over 44,000 people per year. Just to help you understand what that number really means. It is more than twice the amount of people that we lose from homicide, wars, and natural disasters combined. It's more than double. It is, in Pennsylvania, the 11th leading cause of death, and we lose approximately somebody every 5 hours in this state. For every suicide that occurs, 25 other people may attempt suicide in their life. That doesn't mean that they will ultimately go on to die by suicide. Most of them will not. But we do want to prevent people from even taking those actions and those behaviors because sometimes they can be fatal. Employment-wise, we should all care about this, certainly, in addition to the human aspect of this, is that it has a huge economic impact on us. We lose about $44 billion of productivity to our economy every year because of this issue. That's in the form of lost wages, not just for the person who has died and their lifetime of economic contribution, but also the people that were closely affected by the loss, who might have to take leaves of absence or have their own support that they need to go out and seek. So I mentioned that one of the big questions that we often try to answer is why. And research is going to help us uncover more of these answers. We're not all the way there yet, but we're getting there. Some of the goals that we have with research that we fund as an organization, last year we funded $4 million worth of scientific research grants to better understand, can we identify people biologically through different biological tests. So there's currently some information at our table right there about a research study that's going on at Pitt right now. that we're helping to support? Are there different interventions that we can introduce? Different psychotherapies? And of course, medications are not perfect for everybody. Are there different types of progress that we can make there? But really where we've learned the most so far in terms of research is by studying people who have what we call lived experience. These are people who have made an attempt on their life but have done well and have learned from that and have sought treatment. And we've studied them and have learned a lot about the nature of suicide. Typically, what we tend to do with anything is have a very simple explanation. As human beings, we look for simple answers to complex questions. So when somebody takes their life, we often will say, oh, it was because they just got fired from their job. Or if it's a young person, oh, they were bullied at school. So we try to attribute it to one simple thing. But in reality, the nature of suicide is much messier than that. It's much more complicated than that. And what typically happens is many things pile on to a person, and it keeps piling on. And they can no longer deal with that, and they become extremely stressed. We know that one of the biggest risk factors is mental health condition. 9 out of 10 people who have died by suicide have had a diagnosable mental health condition. That doesn't mean they were diagnosed. It means that there was one at least present. And we know that from surveying their family members and things like that. But it isn't the only answer and the only explanation, because 1 out of 4 of us will have some type of a mental health condition in our lifetime. It may be temporary and transient. It may be chronic. And almost, vast majority of us will never have a thought of suicide, much less make an attempt. So that's not the only explanation. We also know from scientific research that the brains of people who have been affected by suicide, who have taken their lives, differ from those who have not. They differ in the areas of stress response and impulse control and things like that. But even with those differences, you can still overcome those differences. They aren't sort of a sentence that will be the outcome, and we know that therapy can work. One thing that we know for sure is that most people who die by suicide don't necessarily want to die. So this is shocking for a lot of people to hear. Well, didn't they do that for a reason? Isn't that what they wanted? Not necessarily. They're ambivalent about it. So what does that mean? It means they are in such pain, such extreme pain, they just want the pain to end. They don't know another option. The pain and those thoughts of suicide might come and go because they're seeking a way to stop the pain. So in the perspective of this person, a crisis has been reached in their life. They're desperate to escape that crisis, and rational thinking starts to become very limited. It's not rational to want to take your life. It's not logical. But rational thinking disappears when you start to get those blinders on, and all you can stay focused on is the pain. So what we want to do with prevention intervention is to start to remove those blinders and help people see that there are other ways and there are other answers to the pain that they are in. Certain people are more vulnerable to this, so let's talk about who's at risk and why they are at risk. When we look at risk factors, we put them into 3 categories: health, the person's history, and the environmental, or in other words, external things that are playing a role in their life. From a health standpoint, we know, as we mentioned, that mental health is a big factor. Depression is by far the most common mental health condition, but that there are others that play a role. Substance use disorders, opioid addiction, things like that, those can also be a factor. They can either precede or be aggravated by a mental health condition, and can coexist. There are other health issues that can also play a role outside of mental health. If you're in chronic or serious pain or have some other type of a very long-standing, difficult chronic health condition, these can be suffering. So in the workplace, certainly keep an eye on people who have other serious health conditions that you want to take a look at whether there are other risk factors or warning signs going on with them. Environmental factors can play a big role. If somebody is having those thoughts and dealing with such difficulty, and if they have easy access to a lethal means, thoughts of suicide can come and go. But if they're in a particularly vulnerable state, and they have access to a very easy way in which to do that, that is a huge risk, and we want to remove that risk factor. Exposure can lead to contagion. We're being asked quite a lot lately about the new Netflix series, 13 Reasons Why. And one of the things that we're concerned about, for example, there is that exposure to the topic of suicide without a narrative about prevention can leave people who are impressionable or people who are suffering vulnerable to suggestion. And that can then lead to a contagion effect. Prolonged stress, on-the-job stress, personal life stress, other stressful life events like a divorce or a death of a parent or a child for another reason, for example. All of those can play a role. And then finally, the person's history. If they've had a family history of suicide, that is a risk. If there's a family history of a mental health condition, if they've had any kind of childhood abuse playing a role in their life, physical, sexual, emotional, and if they've made previous suicide attempts, they can become vulnerable again in the future if they are not taking good care of themselves. So typically, if somebody dies from suicide, what others might attribute to, as I mentioned at the beginning, is a breakup, right? Oh, they just broke up with their boyfriend or they just had a divorce. But what people may not know is what was going on with that person behind the scenes or under the covers. Maybe they had a genetic risk due to family history. Maybe they were suffering from depression and not adequately treating that depression. They might have had very prolonged stress at work, and they started to cope by drinking more than usual or using drugs as an improper coping mechanism to try to ease some of that burden. So again, as you can see, it's very complex. It's that pile-on. It's that multi-layering of things that can really play a role with somebody and not a single reason. On the prevention side, there's things that we call protective factors. So like any other health condition, there can be things that elevate your risk, right? If there's a family history of diabetes and you're eating chocolate cake 3 times a day, you're elevating your risk. A protective factor would be stop eating the chocolate cake. So here it's very similar. You have mental health care and access to that as a protective factor. You can get protection by having a strong family support system or a community support system or a faith-based support system. And also developing better problem-solving skills and coping skills through different types of therapies. Mental health care, however, is the single most important ingredient for preventing suicide, and something that we all want to make sure that we give our employees and our coworkers access to and the permission to go out and get that care. The problem is, in reality, and now we're all talking about mental health like we're all great, wonderful people, right? Oh, mental health, it's wonderful. But are people actually doing anything different? Not really. Only 1 in 5 people are actually going out and seeking care for a mental health condition. We need to see those numbers go up. And yes, we understand that there are capacity issues and wait times to see a therapist or things like that, but we really want to encourage people to just like any other health problem, you want to go out and get care for that health problem. The classic peanut butter and jelly combination for treatment is talk therapy combined with medication therapy. That can be cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy, things like that. There are other types of medical treatments available if those are insufficient. I won't get into some of those super technical terms down there. The good news is insurance right now is allowing us to cover mental health care services equally on par with physical health services because they are one and the same. Again, remember, the brain is an organ in the body, so it should be treated similar. But beyond just within the medical community, that's only one aspect of care. As I always say, treatment for depression isn't always just take a pill and be done with it. You have to take a look at the holistic view of the person. Are they getting adequate exercise? Exercise is known to increase endorphins or those happy hormones, so you want to make sure you're active. Promoting a healthy diet. Again, the chocolate cake, probably not a good idea here either if you're doing it 3 times a day. Getting proper sleep hygiene. That could be oversleeping too much, or insomnia can really wreak havoc on you. And stress management, so learning things like yoga or mindfulness or meditation, things like that can be extremely helpful. And certainly another protective factor, as I had alluded to before, is limiting a person's access to a lethal mean can also help buy them time to change their mind and can save a life. And finally, those who've lost somebody to suicide can be particularly vulnerable because I can't tell you how many times I've gone out in the different events and people we've talked to, and a loved one might say, well, I just lost my son 2 months ago. I want to be with him, right? So we will hear comments like that. So you really have to have, if there's somebody working with you or for you who've recently experienced a suicide loss, be extra special care, give them some extra special care and tenderness and keep a strong eye on them. So what else can you do specifically to help tackle this problem? Help us tackle this problem, all of us. First, you want to watch for the warning signs for a person, and I'm going to go over what some of those are. Reach out. I'm going to give you some specific ways on how to do that. And help that person seek help. So there are 3 areas of warning signs that we want to pay attention to: talk, behavior, and mood. So let me give you some examples of each of those. Talk can be very overt. They can be explicitly saying, I want to end my life. I'm having thoughts of suicide. It can be less overt. And it could be talk about things like, I'm such a burden to my family. I can't stand this pain anymore. I just want this pain to end. I'm worthless. Things like that. And talk can happen verbally, but thanks to social media, it can also happen in an environment like that. So you also want to pay attention to whether or not a person is sharing a lot of content on social media that is of a very dark nature or in keeping with these themes. And if that person is consistently starting to share that content, that is a red flag. Behaviorally, what you're looking for is something that is different for that person. So if somebody has always gone out to happy hour a couple times a week, and they're fine, and they've always done that, you don't necessarily need to be alarmed. But if they're a teetotaler and suddenly they're boozing it up 3 times a week, 4 times a week, or they're starting to increase their intake, or starting to experiment with illegal or illicit drugs, or abusing prescription drugs, these are behavioral changes that you want to put your radar up on. Insomnia can wreak havoc. So if somebody is not sleeping enough or not sleeping well, that can create behavioral problems in and of itself. Reckless behavior, so this is like acting out behavior. And in the workplace, you could start to even see some of that with irresponsible work behavior, showing up drunk at work or drunk at work functions, engaging in criminal behavior or reckless sexual behavior. There's also a withdrawing. So there's an acting out and then there's a withdrawing, where they're withdrawing from the world. They're starting to sever relationships or sever ties with things that they love. They're isolating themselves, looking for ways to kill themselves by doing internet research or sharing content and starting to give away possessions. These are all examples of behavioral signs, warning signs that they might be starting to have thoughts of suicide. Mood-wise, again, you're looking for something that's different for that person, and it should last for more than 2 weeks. So we all have ups and downs. We all have bad days. We all get really anxious at times. But we're talking about consistent behavior that's, they're more depressed than usual. They're very anxious and keyed up all the time, and in situations that don't necessarily call for it. One of the moods that are listed here is humiliation, that people will say, well, what does that mean? Well, we're talking about somebody not having a lot of self-worth, not loving themselves, being very down on themselves. In the workplace, here are some specific signs we can be looking for. Are they missing work? So work absences, showing up late for meetings, not being there on time, punching out early, things like that. Something that's very unusual for that employee. Is there a declining performance at work, or their general attitude towards work? Is the quality of their work or the output of their work starting to slip? Are you starting to see signs of hostility in the workplace? So they're angry with coworkers or managers in an unreasonably so. Maybe even with clients or partners or things like that. Coworker difficulties, HR examples that are more extreme, such as inappropriate behavior with coworkers, drinking to excess. And you can also see changes to physical appearance as well. The way they dress, their grooming, their general demeanor. So these are things to look for in the workplace. The bottom line is trust your gut. If you are concerned about somebody, that's probably reason enough for you to reach out and ask them. And assume that you're probably the only one who might, because so many people are like, it's none of my business, or I'm going to let that person's spouse handle it. It's not my place. You might actually be the only one thinking it or seeing it and have enough wherewithal to reach out to that person. So it's really about talking and saving lives. It's okay to talk about these things with somebody. You're not going to give them the idea to have, to commit suicide or die by suicide if they aren't already concerned about that. So how to reach out? You want to talk to them in private. Never do it in a group setting or things like that. Really listen to their story. You're not there to be their life coach. You're there to really just listen and hear what they have to say, be empathetic, express concern and caring. Ask directly about suicide. It's okay. Are you having thoughts of suicide? If that person says no, they might even come back a couple days later and say, you asked me about that and I told you no, but I actually am. So it might not, the conversation is a dynamic thing. And encourage them to seek treatment. And emphasize that this is a health condition and that it's okay to seek treatment for it. What you want to avoid is minimizing their feelings. Avoid to try to convince them that life is worth living, because those things just don't resonate with somebody in that pain state with those blinders on. And avoid advice on how to fix it, right? So if somebody is having a heart attack, you're not going to start suddenly in that moment tell them that they need to stop eating sausage so much. You really, you want to get them the care and the help that they need and let the medical experts handle it. In the workplace, we can have a plan that can help contribute to suicide prevention. You want to talk to human resources if you're concerned about somebody and if you have a human resources staff. Not every company does. You want to make sure all the employees know what the healthcare benefits are that you have at the company that are available to them with regard to mental health services. And if you have an employee assistance program, EAP, talk about those benefits as well. Provide them with leave if they really need it so that they can get better. You would provide them with leave if they had just had major surgery or if they had just had a stroke. It's okay, and it should be the case that we provide leave for people who need it to get their mental health back in order. Be flexible in their transition back to work. So if somebody has just taken a leave for major depressive illness and they're now coming back to work, you don't want to, on their first day back, throw them a major project and be like, okay, yay, you're back, woohoo. You want to ease that person back into it and make sure that they don't relapse or have a step back in their transition back to work. Make sure you have management training, so you make sure your managers are sensitive to this topic and know how to handle these situations, and foster a stigma-free work environment. You don't want to have a work environment where it is okay to make jokes about mental health or suicide, because that will make people less likely to come forward and to try to get help for that. And then finally, if you are in a workplace that has access to some means that can be used, try to restrict that if possible. If you think that somebody might make an attempt on their life soon, never leave them alone. Stay with them. Make sure they have somebody there with them until help arrives. Try to get them to a mental health services solution, even if that includes an emergency room or calling a crisis center, which can often send a mobile unit out. And of course, there's always a nationwide suicide prevention hotline. So if you're concerned about somebody, you can even call that hotline and they will coach you through what to do. There's also a texting solution by texting START to 741-741. And of course, if there's an immediate danger, 911. So hopefully that gives you a greater sense of how we can create, an environment that's more favorable to preventing suicide. So I'll see if there's any questions after I tell my personal story, which unfortunately encompasses both having gone through the experience of a suicide loss as well as my own lived experience story. My sister Chrissy died at the age of 26. She and I our birthdays were only 2 years apart. And so literally 2 years apart. So we always had joint birthday parties growing up, which was really annoying as kids. But as you see the picture on your right, is us as college students. So she and I were frenemies growing up, but best friends when we were in our college years. Chrissy followed me everywhere. When I joined track, she joined track. When I joined soccer, she joined soccer. When I got a job at McDonald's, she got a job at McDonald's. When I went to Pitt, she went to Pitt. So she was with me like my whole life. And in fact, even up until the day she died, she never lived more than 6 blocks away from me. That's a picture of her with her friends in college, and the last picture ever taken with her and my mother. When Chrissy graduated from college, she got a job as a cancer researcher at the University of Pittsburgh, and she was doing really well professionally. But she was diagnosed with major depression, and she got some treatment for it. She had made I would say a half-hearted attempt. It wasn't a serious attempt, but it was enough to alarm all of us to get her into treatment. And for years she took medications and she went to therapy and she did pretty well. And she also did a lot of those other things I talked about before too. She exercised, she ate well, she did all of these things to kind of have a holistic view of her health. Which is why it really surprised me at the beginning of the summer of 2001 when she approached me and said that she was going to stop all of her treatment. And I told her I thought it was a terrible idea, and I asked her why she's going to do that. And she said, well, because I don't like some of the side effects from the medications, and I've just been on them for years, and I just want to see how I do without them. And I said, well, did you talk to your doctor about this? No, and I'm not going to. So what did your therapist say about this? I'm going to stop seeing him too. I never had this presentation when this happened. I didn't know. I was a little concerned, but I didn't know that was like a major, major, major red flag. Like, really? Yeah, okay. So unfortunately, over the next few months, I started noticing some other changes. She ended a 2-year relationship with her boyfriend, who I introduced her to, and I asked her why, and she said, well, he's really negative, and I want to see how I'll do on my own. Like, okay, another big red flag. There was no real logical reason for her to end this relationship, but she did. She also started giving away some possessions. She started handing me like music CDs and said, "Do you want this? I'm just cleaning out my music library. Do you want this?" And I didn't make anything of it. About a week before she died, we went to a family funeral, and I remember when we were driving back from the funeral, he was a distant family member. We went there more as a courtesy than anything, but when we were driving back, she was like, "Boy, that was amazing." And I said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "Well, there were so many people there. It was really great to see how the family all turned out for all of this. It was really something." It's like, okay, but I didn't understand why she was marveling at a funeral. I was like, okay, it's like every other funeral we've ever been to. A few days before before the last time I spoke with her, she told me that she needed to come over and spend the night with me. And I said, "Why?" And she said, "Well, I think I got a concussion." I said, "Really?" She's like, "Yeah." She goes, "Can I just stay the night?" She never did this, never, even though she lives 6 blocks away. I was like, "Yeah, come on over." So she came over and she really milked it. She really worked it. In hindsight, I know she was probably having thoughts that night about ending her life. But she did reach out. That was her way of reaching out to get help and support. So she came over and she's like, "Oh, look at my eyes. Are my pupils okay?" She was really, really working it to try to convince me that she thought she had a concussion. She was fine. And I said, "Well, I rented this movie from Blockbuster," so I know this sounds really outdated now. It was 2001. And she's like, "Well, I want to watch this other movie." I said, "No, I rented this movie. Let's watch it." So we watched it, and at the end of this movie, there was a scene glorifying a character's suicide. How was I supposed to know? Couple nights later, she called me at 10:30 on a Saturday night and wanted to go to Galifte's. Does anyone remember Galifte's? She wanted to go and get a sinful dessert. She was in the mood for a dessert at 10:30 on a Saturday night. And I said, "No, I'm tired, Chrissy. I've been running around all day. Can I just talk to you tomorrow?" "Yeah." And that was it. That was the last time I talked to her. It absolutely devastated our family. We found that I don't get into any details about this because I don't want to sensationalize her death in any way, much less give people ideas. But at her work environment, she did have access to a means, and that gave her the ability to, unfortunately, do this. But Chrissy never specifically told me that this is what she was thinking about doing. She never told anybody. And had I known, I would have asked her. Had I known that these were things I needed to worry about, I would have specifically asked her, and that might have changed the outcome with Chrissy. As far as I go, recovering from her loss was very difficult. I had already been diagnosed with anxiety disorder, so she had depression, I had anxiety, so sort of like the yin and yang. And her loss really propelled my anxiety quite a bit. I got treatment for it and did all that, and you would have thought I learned a lesson from her, because a couple years after that, I went out of all my treatment. I stopped medication, I stopped everything. So I already had risk factors that we talked about. I already had a diagnosed mental health condition. Clearly, there was a family history of both mental illness and suicide loss. But what happened in 2012 was particularly difficult. My husband and I had for years been trying to get pregnant. I was approaching the age of 40. I know I look pretty young, but unfortunately my body doesn't agree with you. But I was very concerned about not being able to get pregnant. So I started going for fertility treatments, which completely wreaked havoc on my body. I ended up having to have several surgeries that did not go well, and I had a very difficult time recovering from them. And I was officially diagnosed as not being able to have children. Depression onset me for the first time. I had never experienced depression before. Now suddenly my anxiety was through the roof, and I had depression. I had serious job stress at the time. I had recently been promoted to a vice president position at a software company, and I was chairing a major conference that we were putting on. There was a lot on the line. All of this was happening within months of each other. All of it was coming together. And I hadn't been in treatment. So, but the time I dragged myself to the primary care's office and said, hey, I need to get back on this stuff, it was pretty late. I was already really in a bad state. So they tried putting me on the drugs I had been on previously. They weren't working. They weren't helping. So they kept upping the dose. Nothing was working. And in fact, I kept getting sicker and sicker and sicker. My job performance was really suffering. Clearly, people I worked with were very concerned about me. And I started really going into a very bad spiral. My anxiety was awful. It got to the point where I couldn't even leave my house, eventually couldn't even leave my bedroom. I couldn't sleep. I lost about 20 pounds very quickly within a matter of about 3 months. I started excessively journaling and excessively doing internet research, which meant going to a whole lot of websites you shouldn't go to when you're having a health problem, to try to figure out how to fix this, because I wasn't getting better. Nothing was working. And I started developing suicidal thoughts. I started thinking I needed to end this pain. I have no other way to do this. Fortunately, I was already involved with the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, and I knew that that was not the way to go. And I should also mention too that having ability, like things were triggering my thoughts and making my thoughts worse. I couldn't be around knives because I was afraid that I would hurt myself. So like having those lethal objects around, and I had always grown up in a firearms household, but I couldn't be around firearms anymore. So having those things around were making it very difficult. What I ended up doing was making some phone calls to psychiatrists, and unfortunately, they told me that there was like a 5-month wait list to see a psychiatrist, in which I knew that wasn't gonna work. So I put my big girl pants on and told my husband, we're going to Western Psych's ER, because I know I can talk to a psychiatrist there, and I know that I need to stop these thoughts, and I need to get some help. I knew it was not going to be pretty or fun, and it wasn't, but I did get the help that I needed. It took me about 3 months to recover from all of this. I ended up ultimately taking a 2-month medical leave from work, and they were fantastic, and they were great about helping me transition back. Started off transitioning just 2 days a week and eventually worked my way back up to 5 days a week. I participated in an intensive outpatient therapy program, which is called partial hospitalization, but you're never actually hospitalized. It consisted of going to therapy 3 times a week, as well as doing medication checks once a week. Then after that, after I graduated from that, I went to regular cognitive behavioral therapy on a weekly basis. I'm on a completely different type of medication than I had ever been on before, and it's working fantastic. Not that I'm necessarily advocating medication, but for me it works. And I've also learned a lot of new things to help me cope with life and stress, such as yoga and mindfulness and meditation and things like that. I get regular exercise. I could probably afford to get a little bit more. I eat clean and have a lot of family support. So again, a lot has happened and I've recovered, and I'm very proud to say that in the last 5 years, I have never had another thought of suicide again. So I do know that it can be prevented, and hopefully in the workplace, we will all be paying attention to coworkers and people to try to foster these types of environments that are very helpful. So that was it for me. Thank you very much.